In 1849, a young enslaved woman named Anarcha lay on a makeshift operating table in Alabama. She was 17 years old, and she was about to endure the first of 30 surgeries without anesthesia. The man holding the scalpel would become known as the father of modern gynecology. His statues stood in Central Park in South Carolina in Alabama. Medical students learned his name with reverence. But Anarcha, she doesn't have a gravestone. Neither do the other women he experimented on. Their names were almost lost to history. This is the story of J. Marion Sims, and the enslaved women whose bodies he used to build his empire. This is a story about torture disguised as science, about monuments to cruelty, and about a medical establishment that, for over a century, refused to tell the truth. James Marion Sims was born in 1813 in South Carolina, into a world where slavery was woven into the fabric of daily life. His father was a sheriff and a slaveholder. Young Marion grew up believing in the natural order of things, that some people were born to own, and others to be owned. He wasn't a particularly brilliant student. He failed at university multiple times, struggled through medical school, and by his own admission, he was squeamish around blood and suffering. In his early medical practice, he preferred treating wealthy white patients with minor ailments. But in 1835, something changed. Sims stumbled into a new frontier of medicine, women's reproductive health. At the time, gynecology barely existed as a specialty. Diseases of the female pelvis were considered shameful, mysterious, and largely untreatable. And here's where the story gets darker. Because Sims realized something that would define his entire career. Enslaved women were the perfect test subjects. They couldn't refuse. They couldn't sue. They couldn't even speak publicly about what was done to them. In the antebellum South, enslaved people were property. When they got sick, their owners wanted them fixed, not out of compassion, but because they represented financial investments. Sims saw an opportunity. In 1845, Sims was called to treat an enslaved teenager who had suffered severe complications after childbirth, a condition called vesicovaginal fistula. It's a tear between the vaginal wall and the bladder, causing constant leaking of urine. Women with this condition were often isolated, their lives destroyed by pain and shame. Sims examined the girl and made a discovery. He could see the problem clearly using a bent pewter spoon as a primitive speculum. For the first time, a doctor could actually see inside the female pelvis. But he had no idea how to fix it. So he decided to learn on the bodies of enslaved women. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims built a small hospital behind his home in Montgomery, Alabama. He purchased enslaved women suffering from fistulas and began experimenting. The most famous or infamous of these women were Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. Anarcha was just 17 when Sims began operating on her. She would endure 30 surgeries over 4 years. 30. Now, here's where defenders of Sims will tell you that anesthesia wasn't widely available yet. That ether wasn't introduced until 1846, and it took years to become standard practice. But that's only half true. Ether was demonstrated publicly in 1846. By 1847, it was being used in surgeries across America and Europe. Sims himself would later use anesthesia, but only on his white patients. In his own writings, Sims explained his reasoning. He claimed that black women didn't feel pain the same way white women did. This wasn't science. This was racism dressed up in a doctor's coat. This belief that black people had a higher pain tolerance, that their bodies were fundamentally different, was widespread in 19th century medicine. It was used to justify everything from slavery itself to brutal medical experimentation. And it was completely, utterly false. Let's talk about what actually happened in that small hospital behind Sims's house. Because the details matter. The suffering matters. Anarcha's first surgery happened in 1845. Sims, still learning, made mistakes. The fistula didn't heal. So he tried again, and again, and again. Each surgery took hours. The patients were positioned on their hands and knees, what's now called the Sims position in medical textbooks. They were held down by other enslaved women while Sims worked. Imagine being 17 years old. Imagine being cut open, again and again, without anything to dull the pain. Imagine your screams echoing through that room while the man who owned you carved into your body, trying to perfect his technique. Betsy's surgery went so badly that she developed a severe infection. She nearly died. Lucy's suffering was documented in Sims's own notes. She developed blood poisoning, and the pain was so severe she couldn't walk for weeks. But here's what's truly chilling. Sims wasn't ashamed of any of this. He wrote about it openly. He published papers. He described the women's suffering in clinical detail and portrayed himself as a hero for persevering through so many failures. In his autobiography, published years later, Sims wrote, "I thought only of the poor girls who were doomed to suffer as long as they lived." He cast himself as their savior. But he never asked if they wanted to be saved. He never asked if they consented to being cut open 30 times. Because in his eyes, they weren't people who could consent. They were property. Finally, in 1849, after 4 years and countless surgeries, Sims succeeded. He developed a technique using silver wire sutures that allowed the fistula to heal. Anarcha's 30th surgery was finally the one that worked. And with that success, Marion Sims became famous. He moved to New York City in 1853 and opened the first hospital dedicated to women's health, what would eventually become the Women's Hospital of New York. He treated wealthy white women, using the techniques he'd perfected on enslaved bodies. But now he used anesthesia. He was gentle, compassionate. He became the doctor to the rich and powerful, operating on European nobility and American elites. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and the others had been guinea pigs. Once Sims had learned what he needed to know, once he'd perfected his technique on their bodies, he moved on to patients he actually cared about. And the medical establishment celebrated him for it. For over a century, Marion Sims was portrayed as a medical pioneer, a genius, a humanitarian who dedicated his life to helping women. Statues were erected in his honor. One in New York's Central Park, one in South Carolina, another in Alabama. Medical students learned about Sims speculum and the Sims position. His face appeared in medical journals as the father of an entire field. But there was one thing these tributes rarely mentioned. Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. When they were mentioned at all, they were footnotes. Anonymous patients who'd been lucky enough to receive Sims's genius. The torture was sanitized. The lack of consent was ignored. The racism was erased. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate choice by the medical establishment to bury the ugly truth. Because acknowledging what Sims had done meant acknowledging something much bigger. That American medicine was built, in part, on the exploitation and torture of black bodies. Sims wasn't an isolated case. There's the Tuskegee syphilis study, where black men were deliberately left untreated for decades. There's Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken without consent and used to build a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are countless unnamed enslaved people who were used for medical demonstrations, anatomical study, and surgical practice. The pattern is clear. For centuries, black people's bodies have been treated as raw materials for medical progress. And for centuries, the people who benefited from that exploitation have been celebrated as heroes. But in recent years, something has changed. In 2017, a coalition of activists, medical students, and historians began calling for the removal of Sims's statue from Central Park. They argued that celebrating a man who tortured enslaved women was not just historically problematic, it was actively harmful. The response was mixed. Some people argued that Sims was a man of his time, that we shouldn't judge historical figures by modern standards, that removing the statue was erasing history. But others pointed out something crucial. Keeping the statue wasn't about history. It was about who we choose to honor, who we choose to remember as heroes. In 2018, after months of pressure, New York City finally moved the statue from Central Park to a cemetery in Brooklyn where Sims is buried. It was a compromise, not quite removal, but no longer a place of honor in one of the world's most famous parks. Other cities followed suit. In 2018, the statue in Harlem was also relocated. But some monuments to Sims still remain standing, including one in South Carolina. The debate over Sims's legacy has forced medical schools to reckon with their own history. Some have removed his name from awards and buildings. Others have added context to their curriculum, teaching students not just about Sims's contributions, but about the women he tortured to achieve them. But here's the question that still haunts American medicine. Has anything really changed? In 2016, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that half of white medical students and residents still believed that black people feel less pain than white people. Half. In 2016, the echoes of J. Marion Sims's beliefs are still alive in modern medicine. Black women in America are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women, regardless of income or education level. Tennis superstar Serena Williams nearly died after giving birth because medical staff dismissed her concerns about blood clots. She had to advocate forcefully for the treatment she knew she needed, and she's one of the most famous women in the world. If Serena Williams can be ignored, what happens to black women without wealth, fame, or medical knowledge? Study after study shows that black patients receive less pain medication than white patients for the same conditions. That their symptoms are more likely to be dismissed, that they face longer wait times and receive lower quality care. The connection to Sims isn't abstract. The same myths he believed, that black bodies are fundamentally different, that black people don't feel pain the same way, are still embedded in medical training, in algorithms that guide treatment decisions, in the unconscious biases of healthcare providers. In 2019, researchers discovered that a healthcare algorithm used by hospitals across America was systematically discriminating against black patients. The algorithm assumed that black patients were healthier than equally sick white patients, and thus gave them lower priority for care. Why? Because the algorithm used healthcare spending as a proxy for health. And because black patients receive less care and have less money spent on them, the algorithm interpreted this as them being healthier. The legacy of J. Marion Sims isn't just about statues. It's about a medical system that was built on the assumption that black bodies matter less. And until we confront that legacy honestly, people will continue to suffer. Anarcha was 17 years old when J. Marion Sims began experimenting on her. She endured 30 surgeries without anesthesia. She survived, but we don't know what happened to her after Sims succeeded. We don't know if she lived a long life or died young. We don't know if she had children, if she found happiness, if she ever escaped slavery. We don't even know her full name. Betsy, Lucy, the other women Sims experimented on. Their stories end where Sims's story begins. They disappear from the historical record, while he becomes immortal. But in recent years, people have been fighting to change that. In Montgomery, Alabama, where Sims built his experimental hospital, there's now a monument to Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. 3 figures standing together, finally receiving recognition. Medical schools are beginning to teach their names alongside Sims's. Students are learning about medical racism as part of their training. The conversation is changing, but monuments and education aren't enough. The real work is in transforming the system that still privileges some lives over others. It's in believing black women when they say they're in pain. It's in dismantling the algorithms and practices that perpetuate discrimination. It's in making medicine truly serve everyone equally. J. Marion Sims wanted to be remembered as the father of modern gynecology. And in a way he is, but not in the way he imagined. His legacy is a mirror, reflecting back everything that's wrong with American medicine. Every assumption we made about whose bodies matter. Every time we chose innovation over humanity. Every monument we built to cruelty disguised as science. But their legacy, Anarcha's, Betsy's, Lucy's, can be different. They can remind us of the cost of progress. They can teach us to ask who pays the price for medical breakthroughs. They can show us that behind every innovation, there are human beings who deserve dignity, consent, and care. J. Marion Sims has his statues, or had them, but Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy have something more powerful. They have the truth, and the truth is always harder to bury than stone.